I've rewritten the script for this video so many times now that it kind of feels like Theseus's video. And what I mean by that is, like, I don't know if a single word from the original script is in the final one. Like, the idea has completely shifted and changed and evolved into something completely new from where it started. But it is kind of the culmination of the 20 years of my life up until this point. And it has been the most important thing I think I've ever created for myself. And I think it can be a very, very, very important thing to you. You know, if you watch till the end, I think it will drastically change the way you view success and happiness and how to get there. And so I'm gonna talk about Rick Rubin, who is this music producer guy. You might have heard of him. He co-founded Def Jam Records. He's worked with pretty much every big artist you've ever heard of. Metallica, Red Hot Chili Peppers, The Strokes. He's credited with saving Johnny Cash's career. I really like his approach to living a creative life. It's really, really simplified how I see a path to success. To him, creativity is more of a practice than a means to an end. It's a practice of radical self-honesty. He says his sole job as an artist is to be in tune with himself, in tune with his taste, and to be able to express those things clearly. Specifically, the goal is to be in tune with your creative intuition. And to define creative intuition, he gives this example. We are creative antennas. And in the world, there are these creative signals bouncing around all around us. The only thing we can do is to make ourselves the best and most receptive antenna to those ideas. And what that looks like is being brutally honest with what you want to make, not what other people think makes sense, not what makes money, what you want to make and how you can make it the best thing, like how you can refine it to just the core pieces of that thing. So it is the best and most condensed, concise piece of work that gets across the exact thing, exact signal that you're receiving. And these intuitions, what they feel like is like, at the end of the day, when you're tired from work, when everything else, you know, you kind of feel like you've done your job for the day, what you really want to do, what you really want to make, that is what your creative tuition is telling you to make. And so for me, it feels like YouTube videos. It feels like music, you know, it feels like drawing. It's stuff that like makes me just get lost in what I'm doing. And it feels like I can really express things through those things. And so I just have a natural draw to those things. For you, it might not even look like a creative thing. It might even be like business. It doesn't have to be strictly a creative thing. And I'm gonna get to, in this video, how Rick Rubin's ideas, they don't just apply to creativity. They apply to everything, everything you do in your life. And so it doesn't really matter who you are. We can all benefit from knowing what is sincere to us and knowing what is not sincere to us. And that's what this whole video is really about. And so when you do everything that he's talking about, when you listen to your creative intuition, when you act on it with a passion, you're gonna actually end up making your best work. You know, it'll have the best chance to actually resonate with an audience. And it'll make people feel. And for me, that is ultimately the goal. And so here's what that looks like.
Hip hop was just getting started at this time. And I would go to, there was a club called Negril on 2nd Avenue in Manhattan, downtown. It was a reggae club most nights, but one night a week it was hip hop. And this was when hip hop it didn't really exist. And it was this tiny little scene of people playing music in parks, really. It was not it's hard to explain how small it was, how much of a subgenre it was in these days. But there were these clubs where stuff would happen. So I started going every Tuesday night. That's when I was going to NYU. And I just loved the music. And then I would buy every 12-inch single that would come out when it would come out. And none of them sounded like what it sounded like at the club. It wasn't related at all. Live, it was much more of a raw, it was like DJs and break beats, and it was harder. Whereas the record sounded more like an R&B record, but with somebody rapping on it. But it wasn't what we know as rap today. That's not what those records sounded like. They were live bands. They were made by people who made other kinds of music. So they made them the same way they made other kinds of music when hip-hop was really different. So I started making hip-hop records really with the idea of, I just wanted, as a fan, to hear what it sounded like in a club. So it was more almost like a documentarian style, you know? And I would just start documenting what I heard and making things that sounded more like the energy of a club, which was, again, different than these slick records. And part of it was because I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have any training or skill, but that was what allowed it to be new, was it wasn't doing it the regular way. It was doing it the way of hip hop, which didn't yet exist.
So the way to make something good isn't actually to make what you think is good. It's to make what you actually want to make, you know, like I've been talking about. But he does say you can do all of this, and for whatever reason, your art might still not connect with an audience. You know, maybe you're on the wrong platform, maybe you're using the wrong medium, maybe you just haven't really found the way that your art can mesh with society yet. The example I give is this violinist, and this super talented violinist, there's a YouTube video of this, going and playing, you know, selling out a show in DC, and then like a few days later going and playing in the metro, just like as a street performer, like as the trains, you know, are going by and stuff. And people give him like $40 in tips total for the day of him playing. And he's playing just as well as he plays in concert and stuff. So like in that example, obviously his talent is not the issue. It's just like the audience and how he's presented it. And like these people obviously don't get what he's doing. And so that might be your art at some point. And that's fine. You might have to figure things out a little bit. Plenty of artists are sincere and only have a cult following, and that's fine too. You know, ultimately they aren't hugely successful. There's a lot of good examples of this. I would say this is like a lot of artists. But the first one that comes to my mind is this guy named Philo Medusa. Philo Medusa makes frog-themed gore noise. Not really that different, I guess. He puts out like an album a week, and he's done that for like the past couple years. And it's an album a week of original music with like interesting and new ideas every single time. His album names are a little eccentric. He's got Your Lesson in Frog Noise, Every Day is Frog Day, Amphibious Jim Jones, and Retching at the Side of the Pregnant. So good stuff. If you're looking for somewhere to start, I would recommend Amphibians Performing Surgery 3, kind of classic Philo Medusa. I recommend it. Anyways, the guy is absolutely at the forefront of his scene and what he's doing. And it's not easy to make gore noise. It's guitar, vocals, and drums he's doing. And so this is someone that I think Rick Rubin would say is truly living out their creative practice. Not only because he's following his intuitions, which is clear because he's making this genre of music that doesn't make sense to make commercially. You know, he's doing this really refined work in this really specific place that doesn't make sense to make music, you know. But also, it's not just because he's following his intuition, but because he's good. He's very talented. And technical skill is very important still. You know, and this idea that, you know, creative intuition is ultimately what you should be following, it might be easy to think that, okay, well, I'll just do whatever I want because I want to do it, and then if no one gets it, then I guess it's not my fault. No, like, you still need to be thinking about how your technical skill can bring into reality those signals you're receiving creatively. You can't just lazily dump out your thoughts onto a page or onto a canvas and expect other people to get it, unless like it's really that's your art and that's why it's weird. But no, I don't think that's why it is. A technical skill, it allows you to better articulate yourself so that your art has the greatest potential to resonate with people. And so Philo Medusa obviously has great technical skill to be able to make what he's making. And I think that's a core piece of why his art is able to resonate with so many people. But you can't just have technical skill. It's hollow in itself. And an example I give is when I was drawing, I haven't drawn in a while, but I started drawing in first grade. I was just drawing like things that I really thought were cool as a first grader. Tanks, dragons, comic books, dope stuff, obviously. I did that for a few grades, and then the thing is as you draw more and more, unfortunately you get better at it. And unfortunately when you get better at something, people start telling you that you're good at it. And when people tell you you're good at something, you've created this expectation in their mind, in your mind, that you will now be good at that thing. And that you're gonna continue to get better, or you have some sort of bar for yourself. And then you start drifting into, oh, well, certain things I draw better than other things. Or, you know, certain things people like when I draw them more. And so I reached a point, junior year, where I was just pretty much drawing what people thought was gonna be good. And I didn't really even like it a lot anymore, so I kind of stopped drawing a lot. And junior year, I wanted to kind of learn more, get better, because I hadn't really progressed in a meaningful way in a while. So I was gonna apply for this summer program, and I needed to make a portfolio to apply. So I made a portfolio to apply, and while I was submitting it, like I guess I did the normal realism stuff that I normally did, where I would take a picture, it would kind of be cool looking, I like the composition of it or whatever, and so then I would just draw it. When I was submitting my portfolio, there were a lot of spaces to write about, what the piece meant. And I hadn't really considered that. And I think a lot of us get to that point where we don't know, we've totally lost the reason that we're doing this thing that we enjoy in the first place. We've totally lost any of the expression that once existed in this thing we loved doing. And that's totally where I was. And so when I was submitting my piece, I didn't really have a lot to say in those sections. And so when my portfolio, when I wasn't accepted to the program, I thought I just rushed it. I thought I just hadn't really put a lot of time into it, or I hadn't done my best work technically, but that's not the case. So the next year, senior year, I did AP Studio Art, and in AP Studio, in AP Studio Art, I knew I didn't really need to prove anything. Getting a 5 in AP Studio Art is cool, I guess, but it's not it doesn't matter. No one actually cares really. And it's senior year, nothing I'm doing even affects my college apps. So I actually did art. I actually sat down, and because you can do whatever you want in AP Studio Art, there's no criteria, whereas in this portfolio I was making earlier for this summer program, there were some criteria, so I could just try to appeal to that criteria as best as I could. There was no guide rails really. And so I just sat down and I was like, man, I actually have a lot to say. I actually really want to do a lot of different things here. And it actually was really overwhelming because I was finally listening to what I wanted to make. I finally pushed everything else aside. I didn't have to appeal to anybody else. I just had to appeal to myself. And I was like, wow, I can still make what I want to make and have a lot of fun doing it. And it can also still be good. I ended up really discovering how much I like drawing with charcoal because it gave me these really, really, really dark blacks, even if it kind of was messy sometimes and hard to work with. And so I ended up making this portfolio that I'm really proud of. And that's about nuclear fallout and portraying that through animals. And so I'll show some of that on screen now. At the end of the year, my art teacher let me put up in the front of the school through this glass case, this brainstorming board that I put up, and I printed out a bunch of the drawings that I had made, and I connected the drawings based on how I had gotten the inspiration for each. And so it's cool. I basically put on a board my entire year of doing this portfolio, and it's totally different than how I would ever approach art before. I used to just make a piece and I would finish it and then it would be good, or it wouldn't be good and I would throw it away. But I ended up in this creative process in my AP Studio Art class making every piece 5 times because I wanted to get it right, and I wasn't really that tired by it because I enjoyed doing it. And so that's where I'm getting at. I was doing what I loved, and it felt awesome. I would just go in and I would just make what I wanted to make for about an hour every day, and that was really cool. And so that is the destination that Rick Rubin's creative practice is dedicated to. But unfortunately, school does a really bad job at teaching us how to be sincere in our work, and a lot of what we are taught in school and what we are taught by culture in general, it bleeds over into our creative selves. And throughout our most formative years, success is defined by our ability to create work that adheres to a rubric, which is the antithesis of creativity. And it doesn't help that this has been going on for a while. So even the adults teaching us, a lot of them are out of touch with, what creativity looks like and how to teach it. In society, there's definitely value to being able to follow a rubric and to be able to follow laws and, but when you get carried away with that approach and you start applying it really heavily to creativity, it ruins it. And if you only let yourself take pride in making what other people will want you to make, you're gonna get bored, and you're never gonna out-endure the people who are doing what they love. You're never gonna out-endure someone like Philo Medusa, who is just making what they genuinely want to make, and it doesn't really matter the size of their audience, because they just like what they're doing. And that's exactly what Rick Rubin talks about. He has an example where he talks about releasing an album, and he says it received amazing, acclaim from audiences, but he wasn't really happy with it because he didn't think that he made his best work. And the same goes vice versa. If he releases something that doesn't really receive a lot of support commercially, he's still content when it's something that he knows was his best work. But if you're like me, you might be thinking, this feels simple, it feels idealized, it doesn't really seem super well supported, like I'm just talking in the air. And those things make me skeptical, just like they make you skeptical. And when I first heard Ruben's ideas, they gave me so much clarity. And they tied together so many concepts that were just bouncing around in my head. And that's a really awesome feeling to be able to tie them down. But the more I asked the hard questions, the more those ideas lost their shine. And I'm at a point now where I realize that those questions do have sufficient answers. But I think if you're asking them and you're getting stuck on them, then you're kind of missing the point. So I'm not gonna answer them here because I don't think it's really worth it. Because a fundamental and unremovable part of Ruben's philosophy is its simplicity. And that simplicity is incredibly freeing once you get over the fact that it's not like as complex as you might want it to be. So it took me a while to come around to that, but here's what helped me get there. I stumbled across this concept called Agrippa's trilemma, which is a trilemma is just a dilemma with 3 options. It's the idea that we can't actually undeniably prove anything. And I mean literally anything. And every attempt to do that, it's gonna boil down to one of 3 things. And those 3 things are circular reasoning, dogmatic assertions, and infinite regress. Circular reasoning, you probably heard of this one, is when an argument just kind of wraps back around itself, like if the conclusion feeds right back into the claim. If you were to ask Rick Rubin why one of his songs is so good, and he says, oh, it's because it feels alive. And then if you were to ask him why it feels alive, because you're trying to get to the root of his argument, he might say, oh, it's because it resonates. And if you ask him why it resonates, and then he tells you it's because it's a good song, then that's circular reasoning. It's super unsatisfying. And then dogmatic assertions are when eventually at some point in that dialogue that I just presented, say you ask him why it resonates, and he just says, it just does. And we don't really know why, or I do know why, but I can't explain it, or something like that, where it's just like, this is the starting point, and I can't explain why. That is a dogmatic assertion. Also not super satisfying, kind of just speaking words in the air still. And so the last one is infinite regress. And that's when you can keep asking why forever and forever and forever. And there's no logical conclusion. So if you were to ask Rick Rubin why a song is good, he answers, then you ask him why again, and it just keeps going and going. And it doesn't seem like it's reaching anywhere, or it is, but it doesn't. That's infinite regress. Also super unsatisfying. There's never a final answer. And so you can't prove anything. There's no truth that can be undeniably proved without asking you to make an assumption. And those are the 3 assumptions. Dogmatic assertions assume basic definitions and concepts as the starting point of their argument. Circular reasoning assumes that you just believe the conclusion of the argument already, and you're fine with that circularity. And then infinite regresses assume that you're fine without a final answer. So obviously, none of those are super satisfying. And but it's really cool that this thing exists, that this idea exists, because it categorizes everything anyone has ever tried to argue, and it works. It really works. You try it with anything. It doesn't need to be this like philosophical argument. It can be literally a math argument, and I'll get into that later. And if you're curious, the trilemma does apply to itself. You can apply the trilemma to itself, and it still works out. I'm not going to do that because it's kind of boring, but it does actually work. Any argument, it consists of 2 things. You've got a premise and a conclusion. The premise is your starting point, and it's the thing that you believe that leads you to your conclusion. And the conclusion is your conclusion. It's your final verdict. When people argue, especially online, they tend to tunnel vision on the conclusion. And they argue their conclusions without really talking about the premise. I mean, it makes sense. Like if you're talking about your premise a lot and you kind of are really honest with how you got to your answer, you kind of open yourself up to an attack, especially like if you're on like Twitter. Also, we're not very good at accurately self-assessing ourselves. So even if we think we're doing this honestly, even if you think we're talking about our premises honestly, you shouldn't trust someone when they're doing that unless you really know them. And you don't really know a lot of people. Like you don't get this luxury. You don't get the luxury of knowing people enough to know whether or not they're telling the truth, or know whether, you know what their premises are, because you can argue with people online all day and you have you don't know that. And so this creates a demand for a tool that helps us decide for ourselves what other people's premises are. And that tool is this trilemma. It catalogs every argument that's ever been had. And when you get to that premise really quickly, it helps you kind of speed run an argument, and it gets you to the bottom of it quicker. You don't need to linger around in this conclusion land where you're just arguing over words. Because if you get to that premise really quickly, then you can argue about what really has created that conclusion. And it helps you understand people a lot better too, not just their arguments. Because I think that since we are naturally truth-seeking creatures, and we all have these internal truths and beliefs that we start from in every argument, even if we aren't cognizant of it. Since we do that, understanding where people tend to lie on this triangle of circular reasoning, infinite regress, and dogmatic assertion, some people tend to be in these different corners where they prefer a certain type. They're more satisfied by a certain type of assumption. But for the same reason that no one's an introvert or an extrovert, everyone's kind of a mix, no one is just one of these three. And I think, so a better way of understanding it in a more nuanced way is when we're doing stuff every day that we can feel or see, it doesn't really require much of a justification at all. So you can kind of just not even be in this triangle at all, and you can be okay with it. And an example is gravity. When you walk around, you probably don't feel the need to understand space-time and how it warps with mass in order to like trust that you're gonna stay on the ground. You just trust that. You don't even really need an explanation at all. But the second you get more abstract and in the words and rhetoric of things, that's when people tend to migrate to their corners. And I think people do tend, at least in my experience, to be in one of these corners, or generally, split between two, or maybe they're all three, but generally in one corner. And so if you can understand that, if you understand a person as preferring a certain type of assumption, you can really understand them a lot better too. So we're getting pretty far off where I started this video, but trust me, it's gonna wrap back around. All in all, we just aren't that logical. We tend to believe whatever gives us peace rather than what makes the most logical sense. And I think it's far more dangerous to ignore this than it is to admit it, even if it seems unsatisfying. This trilemma helped me judge Rick Rubin's ideas without tunnel visioning on their provability so much. And that has allowed me to actually appreciate his ideas for what they are, instead of just thinking that, oh, they're not super deep, there's no real science, he doesn't really define a lot of his terms. It doesn't really matter. Because an unprovable idea isn't useless. Every idea is unprovable, we just went through that. I think these big ideas, these ways of contextualizing the world, they're like cognitive scaffolding. And what I mean by that is that you temporarily can build them up, and it gives you a heightened perspective of your entire life. If you think of like the ground around you as your life, and you climb up, normally when you're on the ground of your life, you can only see to the horizon, and you really can only see what's right beneath you, the closest. Everything else is pretty far away, and you can't really see it all at once, but when you go up on some cognitive scaffolding, where you're at the top of it, and you're looking down, a lot more things are in your field of view at once. And so these big ideas, they help us see our lives for what they are all at once, and you can't normally do that without them. And so I think you need them. And you might, when you're up there, you definitely lose detail of the ground beneath you. Like, if I'm right here, I can see the ground, I can see a lot of detail on the ground. I could even see ants as they're crawling. But when I'm up on cognitive scaffolding, I might not be able to see that level of detail. But the thing is that the perspective is worth it. And so I think Rick Rubin's ideas lose a lot of detail because they're so high up. They describe so many things, but the perspective it offers is crazy. And so Rick Rubin tells us that less is more for that reason. If you get bogged down in the details of what you're doing, what you're making, like if you're making a song, if you're evaluating an idea, if you're trying to explain an abstract concept, like I am right now, if you get so hyper-focused on the small things, then you're gonna cease to understand your work as a whole, as a body of work. And you're gonna just see it for its imperfections or a sum of its details that people probably don't care about anywhere near as much as you think. And this can ruin your work for your audience, especially if you let it run wild. So from atop the cognitive scaffolding, you become more impervious to this. Concepts look a lot smaller. You can suddenly see your life and how these things support each other and they fit together to create the view of your life and the experience of your life. And so they lose some detail, but the perspective is worth it, like I've already talked about. And if it stops being worth it suddenly or over time, maybe if you start to notice the imperfections of this perspective or your circumstances change, you just need something else, it's scaffolding. You can just take it down and rebuild it somewhere else. Also, it's important that I think your life is a collection, like a city skyline of scaffolding. It's not just one scaffold that you're at a time. There might be one main one, but there's also a lot of little small ones for every little aspect of your life. And so I think that Rick Rubin's is a really tall one, and I hope it I hope it stays in my life forever. I mean, I think it's a really, really great idea. But if it doesn't, it's fine. I could just rebuild it somewhere else. And that's the beauty of it. And I think all of this gets at a thing I've been realizing a lot recently, which is that we don't need to fully understand something for it to be useful to us. And so this clip from Big Think's interview with this guy named Dan gets to what I'm talking about right here.
And what's really interesting about neural networks is the way that they think or the way that they operate is a lot like, it looks a lot like human intuition. Human intuition is also trained by thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of direct experience. Often, our best metaphor for our minds are the tools that we use. So, a really good example is Freud has one of the most impactful models of the mind. And the way that he came up with that is he used the steam engine as a metaphor. So it's an explicitly steam engine based idea. In the 20th century, the metaphor for our minds moved into being like a computer that became the kind of thing that we all wanted to be like. We wanted to be logical and rational and operate like a machine to make the best decisions possible. And I think one of the most interesting things about that way of thinking is it makes invisible to us, and this I think relates a lot to the like sort of Socratic Enlightenment type of thinking as well. It makes invisible to us the importance of our intuition in being the foundation of everything that we do, everything we think, everything that we know. Neural networks are the first technology we've ever invented that works a lot like human intuition. And the reason I love that is because I hope that it makes more visible to us the value and importance of intuitive thought. There's many different ways of knowing things and many different ways of understanding things. And we may not understand all of the particulars of how humans, for example, how our minds come to certain conclusions intuitively. And we may not understand all the particulars of how language models, for example, come to any particular output. But that doesn't mean that we don't understand them. It just means that we understand them in a different way than we might be used to. So, for example, if you use ChatGPT all the time, you develop an intuition for what it's good at and what it's not good at, and when it might be hallucinating and when it might not be. In the same way that you might develop an intuition for when a friend of yours is sad or when a friend of yours is not being totally truthful with you. And that's not a universal set of rules that applies to everyone in every situation or even to your friend in every situation. It's just a sort of like intuitive feel that is a core part of understanding, but that we normally discount. History shows that it is better to have to be open to more ways of seeing and working with the world, and that in this particular era, it's very important to be able to work with things that are a little bit mysterious and be comfortable with that.
So we don't really know how AI works, even people who work on it, but we do develop some sort of intuition for it as we work with it. There's some understanding, even if we can't explain it, even if you're at the point where you can't even really explain why something is AI, but when you're reading it, you can just kind of tell. You do have some sort of understanding that's been heightened. And so I think the crazy thing is that this applies to every science. So this is where I'm getting to the math stuff. I'll start with the example. The speed of light is 299,792,458 meters per second. Why is it that number? Well, I think if you ask a physicist, they would tell you, well, we have equations, a system of equations that, support each other, and we have experimental evidence that backs us up too. And so that is why it is the number. But if you're asking not where we discovered that number or how we discovered that number, but why it is that number, we don't know. And that we don't know lies everywhere. In every field of science and every number, we just don't know. When you think about it like that, science really just describes the world. It doesn't really answer why. And so that is the value of intuition. Everything is intuition. We are all going off intuition at some point. So the idea that we should somehow suppress what we really want or not really listen to what we really want is just ridiculous. And of course, it can feel better to feel like we do really have an answer to something. And unless we're given a reason not to think that, then we kind of just default to thinking that we do have the answers for everything. Like, oh, we kind of just generally think that science knows a lot, like it knows a really large amount of information. But I think it's more dangerous to like vehemently hold on to an incorrect answer just because it's more comfortable than it is to admit that we just don't know. Because there's immense peace in admitting that we don't know. Rick Rubin's ideas aren't founded in a system of equations, but they are founded on his observations of the world. And while those things might sound very different, they're really not. He says we know a percent of what there is to know, of what there is to know. And I think that's really wise. And so here's what I'm gonna wrap it up. I'm circling back to where we started. It's still really countercultural to listen to your intuitions, because there's this immense pressure to have clear-cut, well-described goals. And it seems like the last thing we're concerned about is what makes us feel fulfilled. We might say we care about it, but then the second that, there's a point of decision, we aren't really willing to admit what we don't know about, what we like. We want to be able to describe what we want. We want to be able to describe everything and justify everything we do. But it's just not a realistic expectation. Most people don't know their life's destination until they're right up on it. And this even assumes that you have a destination. What I mean by destination is just a place in your life where you feel fulfilled for a time. And as a young person, as any person really, it doesn't matter how old you are, don't feel like you need to know exactly where you're heading, like at all. Just stay on the road and stay moving. Because if you're moving in any direction, if you're meeting people, if you're going places, you're trying new things, that is when you will learn what you like and what is you. That's when you'll develop your intuition. You can't have intuition for something you've never done. So it's really, really important that you try a lot of things and experience a lot of things. Here's an analogy that I made up that I think really, really well describes what I'm getting at here. In life, we are in a car and we're on the road. We have provided to us a compass right here in our laps that always points towards what we like doing. But it is just a compass. Compasses just point in a direction. They don't give you distance. They don't give you much precision. There's only so much precision in a compass. And so it's really tempting to use the GPS that you're also given that doesn't point anywhere though. You're just typing in an address. You think you might know where you want to go in life. And so you might type it into your GPS because it's much nicer. Other people will be more pleased if you have a clear-cut answer of where you're going. It makes more sense to know exactly where you're going. I've been going from GPS stop to GPS stop my entire life, it feels like. I've been just typing in places that I think I want to be, and then when I either reach that point, realize that it's not what I thought it was, or on the way, I realize that I don't want it bad enough to even get to the end, that's when I just type in another place. And I think that I try to line it up with my compass, and I try to look at my compass, and I'm looking at where it's pointing, and I'll type in an address of where I think that might be pointing. But that's not really enough, because when you've been GPSing your whole life, you get burnt out, you get really, really tired. And then you look down at the compass that's been sitting in your lap this whole time, and it's always pointing to where you want to go. The needle is dancing around, always pointing to what you like doing. And you realize that all you can really do is follow your compass. It might make more sense. Maybe you do need a destination, a placeholder destination, but ultimately don't get attached to your GPS destination. To the extent you can, turn your GPS off and just look at your compass and follow it as the needle takes you around wherever it may take you. And it's not going to be accurate. Listening to what you really want to do in your life, what really is sincere to you, what resonates with you, what you enjoy doing, what makes you feel real and what makes you feel like yourself, it's really hard to describe. As you do it more and more, it develops and you can describe it a little bit better and you can sort of know where it's kind of heading. And as you narrow it down, your compass is going to start to point to where you really want to go. So I think that ultimately you should be looking at your compass as much as you possibly can. And it may really seem like everybody is using their GPS to get to where they want to go. When you're on the road, you're looking at everyone else. Everyone's moving. It seems like everyone knows where they're going generally. But they really don't. And if they're using their GPS, they're probably just going to arrive at the same place you did, man. They're just going to get somewhere they realize they didn't want to be, and they're just going to type in another place. It doesn't mean they have anything else figured out. Some people who seem like they're at their destination seem like they've gotten there because they've been typing in stuff to the GPS. And if they did, they got really, really lucky. And if they didn't, then it might not be so apparent. Here's the last few things to keep in mind. Nobody does one thing. Literally nobody does one thing. You might think of people you think that only do one thing, like artists, people who seem to like really just like doing what they like doing, and it's this one specific thing that they make their career out of, like guitar players, you know, vocalists, you got businessmen, philosophers, stuff like that. They don't really do one thing, and if they do, they are absolutely miserable. They balance their creative lives. They do things that aren't to make money, that aren't to appeal to an audience, because the truth is like when you make money off of creativity, like there, to an extent, it is kind of inescapable that there's this pressure to appeal to an audience. I'll give you an example, Eric Andre. If you don't know who Eric Andre is, I'm sincerely sorry. He was talking about in an interview I watched about how comedy is his day job, and he likes comedy, but it's also his day job. So in his spare time, he recently made what is it called? I guess an orchestra album, like a film score kind of thing. And he did it not because it was going to make him any money, and not because he thought a lot of people were going to listen to it, but because he really wanted to make it. And so he made it, and he had a great time making it. And that kind of stuff keeps him sane. And so like there's a lot of stuff that keeps people sane that you don't see because it's not meant for you, you know? So don't feel like you need to just do one thing. It probably does feel that way, because I mean, you probably make the most money if you did one thing, but no one actually does one thing. So don't ever put that expectation on yourself. I gotta wrap up because there's Frisbee golfers that are trying to take my spot here. There's a balance between what you want to do and making it possible in society, because obviously you need to make money. You can't just sit around doing what you want to do all the time. You do need to kind of appeal to a genre, appeal to an audience at some point. And I think it's all about finding your balance of adhering to a rubric, but also doing something that's creative and fulfilling. And it honestly might be a lot different than you think it is. You might think you might want a lot more creativity than you do, but stability is really cool too. So I think it's about finding your balance. There's nothing wrong with like working a normal job. Like Rick Rubin talks about, if you're a comedian, you know, there's this weird pressure to like quit your job and like put everything in the line to make your dreams come true. But it might not make sense, you know? It doesn't make sense to like quit your job as a comedian, because if you have a nice job, I guess, because these comedy shows are happening at night. And so if you quit your job, you're just making your jokes all day. And maybe that works for some people, but if it's gonna ruin your comedy because you're so stressed out about making enough money to survive, then don't quit your job. There's something wrong with doing an uninspiring job if it lets you do what you wanna do. And so last thing, you have to move in a direction to get inspiration. You can't just lock yourself in a room and like with like a pencil and paper waiting for an idea to sprout. Like that's not really how it works. Inspiration comes from action. So you need to go out into the world and try new things and interact with people, even if that's not literally progressing you forward. Even if it seems like, oh, I need to be working on my creative project right now because I need to make a living off it or whatever. But working on your creative project is having fun and just going out with your friends and watching a movie. Like, think about like when you watch a really good movie and you come out of the theater and you're like, your perspective is like totally elevated. That's like a very palpable example of inspiration coming from action. And it comes from all types of actions. So don't lock yourself in a room like it's like grind season or something stupid that like these YouTubers they're telling you is like the way to do things. Don't do that, man. Like, that's not gonna work. So the moral of the story is to be yourself, follow your compass, and follow it even if you're worried about other people telling you that it doesn't make any sense.
From the beginning, I never thought any of the things that I'm doing were possible or realistic. I just did things out of the love of them, thinking I would have real jobs and, that my passion would be my hobby and I'd have a job to support my hobby. and it just magically turned out different than that without me knowing it was possible.